Hello, Véronique.
Hi, hello, Anthony.
It's lovely to talk to you. So I'm very honored to be asked to engage in conversation with you about this new book published today in translation by Other Press this month. Other Press, it's in the company of men, en compagnie des hommes, and it's, well, I enjoyed reading it very much. So as Melanie just said, you're a writer, a poet, a novelist. You've also been a teacher, a professor. You've written children's books. And you illustrated your own children's books. So you're a children's book illustrator. And I imagine you translated this novel into English.
Well, it went through several phases.
But you
it was a work of collaboration and love.
Okay, good. So I noticed that one of your children's books, Grandma Nana, as it's called in English, Grand-mère Nana, has been translated into Albanian, Bengali, Turkish, Somali, Vietnamese, and Urdu. So that's a book that's traveled across many, many cultures and continents, like you, because you've traveled to many places. You've taught in South Africa. You've been in the United States. You've been in Mexico, Abidjan, obviously, where you grew up. We'll talk about that. And Paris, where you studied. Did you study with Michel Favre at the Sorbonne? Who was your teacher?
No, unfortunately, no.
But you did study African.
Mine was Mr. Perrotin, Professor Perrotin.
Okay. Yes. So now I think I know why I was asked to talk to you. You were born before Ivoirian independence in Paris, the colonial metropole, but grew up in Abidjan in Ivory Coast, where your African father and European mother raised you. And I was born before independence in London, the colonial metropole, and grew up in Kumasi in Ghana, next door to Ivory Coast, where my African father and European mother raised me. And I know because Baoulé, the language of the area around Abidjan, is closely related to Tree, my father's language, that Nana is what you call your grandmother in these Akan languaguages.
Absolutely.
So that's why presumably she's called that. And in fact, one of your books, Reine Poku, Queen Poku, is about the perhaps mythical founding of the Baoulé civilization as an offshoot of the one that I grew up in Kumasi, because Poku is supposed to have come from Kumasi.
Yes.
So,
and may I add that my father's village, called Mafere, is about 10-15 kilometers from the border with Ghana.
Right.
So, you know, we are from the kind of same area.
Same area. It's just that, but we can talk about in part the fact that we had the different experiences of French and British colonialism and the different experiences of growing up, in your case, Francophone, in my case, Anglophone. But I also should say that in Loin de mon père, Far from my father, you wrote about a father's funeral from the point of view of a child coming home to West Africa. And I wrote in my book, In My Father's House, I wrote an account of my own father's funeral as a child coming back from abroad and being reabsorbed into these amazing African funeral customs, these Akan funeral customs. Anyway, so we'll get to the new book in a bit, but if you won't mind, I'd like to begin by just a little bit about talking about growing up in that decade after independence in post-colonial Abidjan, in post-colonial Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. The young woman protagonist in Loin de mon père, who's called Nina, talks about being called Bofoué. Is that how it's said, Bofoué? Which is related to the word brofu in Tree, which means, which is usually translated as white person or European these days, though we could have an argument about whether that's a good translation. I'm curious, though, that reading about that made me think about whether experiences like that happen to you, because Nina is not you, she's a character in a novel, and whether that affected your relation to your sense of identification with Ivory Coast or with Africa, that sense that people recognized that you were not, as it were, or thought of you as not fully local. Did that?
Well, I guess it's about the perception of difference. It's always very complicated. First, if we talk about the traveling, the fact that I've been living in different places, I think I always say that traveling was in my blood. I was born because of traveling, thanks to traveling, because my father went to France to further his studies and met my mother, who accepted then to go to Côte d'Ivoire, and she lived there up until her death. So, you know, when you've been raised like that, it stays with you. But I was raised in Côte d'Ivoire, and that makes a big difference, because Côte d'Ivoire is my point of reference. It's what feeds my writing, and those years following independence were, of course, the prosperous years of Côte d'Ivoire, when Côte d'Ivoire was considered as the pearl of Africa, or at least Francophone Africa. And a lot of people came to Côte d'Ivoire because it was the happening place. It was really, it was under Houphouët-Boigny, of course, the first president. And he was a tall figure. I mean, he was someone who knew about politics. You know, today you might wonder whether he could have done better in terms of finding a good successor. Unfortunately, at the end of his time, Côte d'Ivoire was already experiencing serious difficulties in terms of the social fabric, but also in terms of the economy, because you had the devaluation of the CFA franc, and you had the beginning of souring relationships with France, the former colony. So all, you know, everything was moving, and unfortunately moved in the wrong direction.
But the period immediately after independence, I mean, Houphouët-Boigny was in power for more than 30 years, and you were talking about the fact that towards the end, things went downhill. But that period in the 60s and 70s was quite exciting, I think.
Absolutely exciting. It looked like everything was possible.
Yes.
And that was, I think we were kind of privileged, I must say, that because it seemed that the whole world was open to possibilities. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And did you move back and forth between Abidjan and your father's, the village that your father's, or the town that your father came from?
Absolutely, because we went regularly to Mafere, to the village, and that was part of life, going to the village on a regular basis. So yes, yes, and I could see the evolution of the village, changing from a small place to a kind of small city, and now to a much bigger place, with the advantages and the disadvantages of that sort of transformation.
Yes. So how do you feel about what Abidjan's like now? I mean, because just to tell the people who are listening to us, that, you know, there were two civil wars basically in Côte d'Ivoire since independence. I guess one, let's see, in the sort of early 2000s, and one around about 2011.
The rebellion.
Yeah. And
first the rebellion coming
yes,
from the north, and then the post-electoral crisis of 2010, 2011.
But that means that your city, I mean, for periods, and you were visiting during these periods, you were there, the city was full of, you know, soldiers who were not fully under control, and violence and death on the streets. It must have been very painful.
Yes, it was very disheartening, because you couldn't understand. Sometimes you kept thinking, what has happened? How did it go so wrong? In a way, so fast. You're talking about, you know, Houphouët-Boigny being in power for 30 years, but really you're talking about 20 years, because the last 10 years were like, I'm not sure he was fully in control. And then there was this military coup, and that tipped the country over. So it's difficult then to recognize the country and to understand what is going on, because a lot of things have moved drastically, and the question of identity has been raised sharply by something that you might know, I'm sure you know, which is Ivoirité,
Yes.
which is you would say Ivorianness in
Yes.
English, which is simply asking the question, who is Ivorian and who is not? When you ask a question like that, it sounds like it's so what? You want to know where you come from. But it's all about who has the answer to that question, and who decides who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I think that was a way where a direction where Côte d'Ivoire went because of the high level of immigration. And it was very badly handled by the politicians, and it kind of derailed completely and created a scission between the North and the South. And
Right.
we still haven't recovered from it.
Right. So, I mean, in effect, people were arguing that some of the people in the north of the country weren't really Ivorian. And in particular, of course, President Gbagbo argued that President Ouattara wasn't really Ivorian, and used that as a basis for saying that he shouldn't be allowed to compete in the elections.
Yes, you see, it's because of, I mean, the borders, as you know, have been drawn not according to cultural affiliations and, identities, but just like that for economic reasons. And therefore, you sometimes have tensions, and the people of the North may find that they have closer links with Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso. And
Right.
then as you go down to the coast, all the countries along the coast, like Ghana, you have a lot of affinities with. So it's not that it's impossible to build a nation, but it's much more difficult, and it has to be handled properly. And I think that we didn't have the type of leaders at the time to handle that question of identity properly.
I mean, I think it's obviously one of the great challenges in much of post-colonial Africa has been to build a sense of national identity in places where traditions are very multiple. There are 80 languages in Ghana, and there are people with Muslim traditions, people with traditions that are neither Muslim nor Christian, people with Christian traditions, and so on. People with matrilineal families like the Akan, and people with patrilineal traditions like the Ewe, and so on. And people who were historically enemies. I mean, that is, they fought wars against each other. And so one of the challenges has been to bring people together, especially because to some extent the colonial period exaggerated perhaps some of the divides. And I think
but you talk of some of the people who were enemies, but there were a lot of alliances as well.
Oh, yes.
And those alliances were forgotten. And today, some people are thinking, look, we need to look at this pattern of alliances and maybe go back to it and talk to people in that way, and then they span a big territory,
yes.
those alliances, and sometimes in the most unpredictable way. I mean, not unpredictable, but you didn't expect it.
Yes.
And yet you've got this whole line of possible alliances.
Well, we mentioned one earlier, right? The Baule, which is a large identity in the Ivory Coast, is connected with Fanti and Asante and the Akan civilizations of Ghana. And so there's a large area of Akan
Exactly.
cultures, which did have battles among them, but still they had this background culture that's very much in common. They have the same names, many of the same traditional religious ideas, and so on. So, as you say, you could build on this, and I think that has happened to some extent in Ghana anyway. That Akan, which really wasn't much of an identity when I was a child, really is now, and it brings together people who historically were, fighting one another, but who have these shared traditions. And I imagine the same thing happens with the Akan people in Ivory Coast.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they go all the way to the center and have alliances with some people from the north. So this is something we should tap into. Definitely,
right.
There is a potential there.
Do you you wrote this book about Queen Poku, so it's the founding myth of Baobab identity. Did you grow up hearing such stories, or did you find that story in a book?
No. I grew up with that story.
Yes.
I grew up with that story because we were talking about Ofo-Edouani before, and then you had Conan Bédier, his successor, who was ousted in a coup, and they were Baolé people. Therefore, they were the dominant cultural group in Côte d'Ivoire, the dominant elite for a long time. So in fact, the legend, the myth of Reine Poku was constantly recounted. And so I grew up with her and with the idea of this queen. But at the same time, I realized that there were lots of aspects that were not said about her story.
Right.
And mainly that she came from beyond the borders of Côte d'Ivoire. And so she was an immigrant herself.
Yes.
And of course, that is not really emphasized in the story. And I thought it was very interesting, a very interesting mythical character as well.
I mean, one of the things you do in your book about her is in a way connected with something that is in the book that we're supposed to be talking about today, which is this, as it were, taking different approaches to the same events and retelling them and retelling them in the way that they might seem, with different ideological perspectives, different views of thinking about, well, the gender politics of this way of telling the story is not so great, so let's see if we can tell a story in another way. The sort of the class politics of this way of doing it is not so great, and so on. And then, I'm afraid I haven't read all your books, but in other of your books, I find this interesting thing, which we're going to talk about in The Company of Men, this business of coming at the story from many angles. And I wonder if you could, before we turn specifically to how you do it in The Company of Men, how did you come upon that way of doing things, which seems to me a feature of your books are very different from one another. I'm not saying by any means that they're all kind of cookie cutter, but they have this shared thing where you sort of take a slice at it from one direction and then another direction, and you get a kind of layering of the picture. I wonder whether you think of that as something you just came upon because it seemed natural, or because you found it somewhere, or some combination of the two.
No. As I said earlier, I was raised in Côte d'Ivoire, and the art of storytelling and the African oral tradition, and I was raised with in the oral tradition, and it gives you an amazing freedom. That means the storyteller, the griot, even the griot from the north, is able to bring in different genres, poetry, songs, even historical facts, even genealogical stories, even political language. So there is an enormous freedom in the way of telling the story. But it's also because I am hesitant to give a linear story. I don't like linear stories. like, sit down, I'll explain, you know, and you will understand everything. This is not, I think, the way life is. And also, it's not what is in our minds, because in our minds, there are many, many, many things. You might be watching television and being bombarded by the news. Then you have your own personal issues. Then you have, you're thinking about your mother who is sick somewhere in the hospital. Then you're thinking about you. There's so many things in our heads that nothing is linear about our life. I think it's a fiction to think that
Yes.
we can lead a linear life. And it's also because I want to hear many voices, because there's so many points of view, different points of view, and you saying this, but then you turn around and you ask someone else, and they've got another point of view. So how do we reconcile and reconcile with one another and talk to one another if we don't listen to our different points of view? So
Right.
that's how I like to tell a story. You could say some people at the beginning, because the first book I wrote was As the Crow Flies, and that was the first time I was using that technique, if you want. And people said, "Oh, but that's the roman nouveau." I don't know if you've heard about the
Yes,
roman
yes.
nouveau.
Well,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you were going to say something about that, because I mean, that sense of the that is something that exists. I mean, your fiction I think of as sort of francophone African fiction, but in metropolitan French fiction, there is this other tradition, which is in some ways also like this, that it gives you, it's a kind of, you move between one consciousness and another, and so on. But you think of this very much as something that comes out of your background in Abidjan. In Ivory
Yes,
Coast.
but one thing also that I can add is that my mother was an artist.
Yes.
She was a painter and a sculptor. And when you want to look at a sculpture, you have to go round it. There's no way. It's not one just fixed
Right.
flat picture. You have to go, and that's how, in a way, I proceed. I like to go round and look at all the aspects, all the sides.
We don't have time to talk about it as well, but I'd just like urge our people listening to look at your book about your visit to Rwanda, or your visits to Rwanda after the genocide. And this combines the two things we've been talking about, these struggles over identity, which are part of all modern African history, and this taking of perspectives, this telling the story from many different points of view, rather than saying, I have come in, I'm going to tell you what's going on here, I'm going to interpret this, I'm going to tell you what really happened. You allow different voices in the Rwanda book too. And I must say, I found that, I wouldn't say it's not exactly enjoyable, because you're reading about something awful, but it's a wonderful book, if I may say so. And so I do recommend it but we should turn to talking about the book, today's book, the book that's coming out today in English in the United States. So that too does this thing that we've been talking about, coming at it from many, many angles. But it's, and insofar as it's about something, of course, it's about the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa. Let's see, what years were they? I've forgotten the dates, but anyway.
2014.
14.
I mean, end of 2013, beginning of 2014.
Right. So 2013, 14. And they, of course, these happened in a bunch, not just in one country, but in a series of, the thing spread and so on. And so because it is about that moment in the history of West Africa, it isn't a national story. It's a story that's told in a way that makes sense from the point of view of people in a bunch of societies. But the way you do it is we begin with a moment in which a sort of, no doubt, I mean, I don't know whether this is what really happened, but a kind of fictionalization of the moment when two boys go into the forest, into the bush, and they kill some bats and they eat them, and that's probably how the virus enters them. And so it enters the human community. One thing that's going on there, and this is a theme in the book, I think, is the sense that that this escape of the virus is in part the result of a kind of irresponsible attitude to the forest, to nature. So there's a kind of ecological perspective. Does that seem right to you?
Yes, I wouldn't say irresponsible. I would just say that it's happening all over the world.
Yes.
Which is the degradation of our environment, and deforestation has a big role to play in epidemics, in the sense that if you destroy the environment of wild animals, they will come closer to human beings, closer to villages, and they will feed on whatever is available in the villages around the forest. And this can bring the disease closer to human beings, because if there's a forest, a huge dense forest, and the animals are further down in the forest, there is not much interaction. So this is a well-known phenomenon. But you also have industrial farming, for example, which is another way of bringing diseases. When you have a concentration, high concentration of cattle or chickens or whatever, and that they are really badly treated, and it also brings diseases. So
yes,
there are all forms of, it's the lack of respect for what should be more balanced in our life. So I think it's a worldwide
yes,
concern.
absolutely. I mean, this is of course the epidemic that we're now facing now, in part, is the result of we think of humans coming close to animals that didn't that were historically further away from us because they had their own environments. But the thing about this book that seems interesting to me, which connects with what we've been talking about all along, is the way you do it. Is you tell the story. There are these boys at the start, but then tell us how you do it. From then on, we're sort of having a slice on the events of the crisis, of the epidemic, through different points of view, and not just the points of view of human beings, also the points of view of the trees and of the bats, and in fact the point of view of the virus itself, of the Ebola. We agreed that you would just read for us a little bit from one of those passages where it's the tree, the baobab, talking about its angle on all these things. So why don't you do that now and we talk about it?
Yes, yes. So it's because I wanted to give an environmental dimension to the epidemics. And so in this first, if you want, in this chapter, is the Baobab Tree who is speaking. And because the Baobab Tree is the witness of the epidemic, for having been at the center of the village where the outbreak is happening. So I'll start reading. We, the trees, our roots run all the way down to the heart of the earth, and we can feel the beat of her pulse. We inhale her breath. We taste her flesh. We live and die in the exact same spot, never moving from the land we occupy. Both prisoners and conquerors of time, we stand riveted to the ground, yet soaring upward, reaching for the clouds. We adapt to all weathers, rain or shine, hurricanes or the dry Harmattan winds. Our crowns merge with the sky's cottonwool dreams. We are the link between man and his past, his present, and his unpredictable future. We exhale the fresh breath of morning. Our sap is vital force. Our souls hundreds of years old. We see everything. We feel everything. Our memory is intact. Our consciousness dwells beyond space and time. We have listened to stories both happy and heartrending, and we shall witness new life cycles in the future, for such is the passage of time. We were here to last. We were here to spread our shade over the remotest lands. We were here so that our foliage would murmur the secrets of the four corners of the world. But human beings have destroyed our hopes. No matter where in the world they are, they wage war on the forest. Our trunks crash to the ground with a sound like thunder. Our naked roots mourn the end of our dreams. You cannot destroy the forest without spilling blood. Humans today think they can do whatever they like. They fancy themselves as masters, as architects of nature. They think they alone are the legitimate inhabitants of the planet, whereas millions of other species have populated it since time immemorial. Blind to the suffering they cause, they are mute when faced with their own indifference. Their voracity is boundless. It seems impossible to stop them. The more they have, and they already have everything, the more they devour. And when they are finally sated, they turn to other cravings, commodities, money, flashy trifles. They waste what they have and grab one another's natural resources. They dig deep into the belly of the earth. They dive into the seas. They'll go on until there is nothing left.
It's very powerful, I think. And
You want me to?
well, I was going to say, I mean, so we've got that voice, right? That's one voice. But we also have a lot of very moving human voices, the voices of people who have to bury the dead, the voices of doctors and nurses, the voices of course, people suffering themselves, and the voices of people taking in other people's children because their parents are gone, and so on. And what I thought was so sort of interesting about this was that in the end, you get a very powerful sense of all these different impacts of the virus. It's not just, as it were, so many people dead. It's the change, the society's being shaped and changed, and people responding. And I thought the way that you chose to do that and was perfectly suited to your style, which is to not to take a kind of single line through the material, but to how much research did you have to do for this? I mean, how much of this was just because you were following it as it happened at the time?
Oh, quite a lot of research. In fact, the moment the outbreak started, I felt very compelled to know more and more about it, because of course, Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone are neighboring, countries, especially Guinea and Liberia. Guinea in the north and Liberia in the west. So it was like we were all expecting the Ebola epidemic to spread to Côte d'Ivoire, and everybody was on high alert and taking all the precautions. So of course I started worrying about my friends Guinea, my friends in, that I have friends in Liberia as well, but also in my family in Côte d'Ivoire. So sometimes being away makes you even more anguished. So I would try to get everything I could about every information I could on the epidemic. And this one thing that you must remember is that this epidemic was heavily reported in the media, and so you had an enormous amount of information. For example, I remember going online and looking at the work that MSF, that means Doctors Without Borders, were doing, and you had a whole graph of an Ebola treatment center, explaining everything. So that's amazing, the kind of information there was. And I also went to conferences because at the time I was in South Africa, and there were a lot of conferences on the topic because everybody was preoccupied by the situation. I also happened to travel to the United States at one point during the epidemic, and I was at Rutgers University, teaching at Rutgers University, and there again there was a lot of information in the sense of conferences and meetings, and so I everywhere I could get information, I went. I read the academic books, the testimonies from medical workers, the testimonies from survivors, and also I have a lot of friends who are in the medical profession, so I did discuss a lot with them, what the situation was.
So, I mean, the Ebola story is in some ways a hopeful story. I mean, that is, people responded, got organized, defeated the virus, and also people, in a way, though it had bad consequences, the humane initial response to the victims, the unwillingness to let people die on their own and so on, of course, that did lead to more deaths, but it also was it's a sign of a kind of decency, human decency, that I think is very much there in the book. Do you think of the book as a hopeful book in that sense, in the sense that it's a horrible thing, but you get through it?
Yes, I think it's in a way it's a hopeful book, because I hope you understand better that everything is connected. The state of the environment, the degradation of nature, climate change, and our health. And so things don't happen like out of nowhere. It's important to understand the connections and to understand what we can do to help ourselves. I think that's the main thing that I understood, is that we are the problem, but we also are the solution. And it's a question of collaboration and solidarity. In the case of Ebola in West Africa, international solidarity took quite a while to kick off. But once it did, some people say out of fear that it would spread further from Africa, it changed everything. And that's what we can take on, because we are in a pandemic today, and I think that sort of solidarity needs to happen again, and in a more holistic way. That means there's no way trying to hoard vaccines in, inside one country when the rest of the world is still fighting against the pandemic. I think this time we have to understand that we really in it together, and that we have to find forms of collaborations that are going to be lasting. Because the problem with aid and very often that sort of sudden influx of money and equipment, and it sometimes is not lasting. That means that when the problem finds a solution, you think, I mean, even if it's not a lasting solution, then things go back to normal. And I think that that's to be avoided. I think if we have to do something, that's what I came to understand, is to put much more emphasis on prevention, and therefore
and building a kind of global solidarity,
exactly.
because you can't do prevention one by one. You have to do it
exactly. This is harder, but
yes.
it's more durable.
Well, I found a poem of yours in Ami Chemin, which I thought we could end with, since we are speaking, hopefully, at the moment, which is, you'll have to excuse my French, but I'll translate it. Nous irons chercher l'espoir et nous le sortirons de son enclave profonde. We will go looking for hope, and we will take it out from its deep enclave. And now I think we can invite, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you. And now we have a chance to invite the people in the audience who have questions to put them to you. So Melanie will take over that process of running the Q&A.
Thank you both. That was so wonderful to listen to you. This is a question from Adrienne. You mentioned oral storytelling as part of the tradition you draw from. How do you view your writing as part of that tradition? As a document in time or a definitive statement, since it will not be retold in a literal sense?
Oh, okay. Sometimes I have this idea that the reader can continue the stories. Like, for example, in the company of men, you have the portraits of several characters who fought against the disease, or who were witness to what was happening. And in my mind, there could have been more of these characters. So for me, it's a question of interaction, and you can always retell a story. That is the essence of stories. They are what we leave to generations, and each generation, in a sense, retells its own stories. That's the way I look at it. You take the oral tradition, and you take the storyteller, and in the African oral tradition, and the storyteller will adapt to the new audience and will bring in some details that are particular to the time, the present time, the contemporary time. And I think that's very important. And that's why people have constantly rewritten books, taken classics, adapted them to a new audience. This is the essence of stories.
Do you think you have Ivoirian writers today who are picking up, obviously every writer does their own thing, but are picking up on some of the trail that you have left for them, or what's happening in Ivoirian writing today?
Oh, lots of things are happening. A lot of young, upcoming writers, but everybody, I think, has been in one way or the other influenced by oral tradition. Absolutely, that is a heritage, a cultural heritage that we have, and without even doing it, I mean, without forcing it, it comes into the story and weaves itself in contemporary life. It's almost a kind of way of looking at the world, which is typically coming from that tradition.
Mm-hmm. Melanie?
Yep, one more question for you. I'm sure there'll be more. Please go ahead and type them in the Q&A form if you have them. This one is from Anderson. As you said, there was a lot of media attention to the Ebola crisis, but do you think some of the lessons were overlooked and neglected since it was contained in one region in West Africa? Could we have learned more to be better prepared for the present global pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. I think some lessons, some key lessons were learned in terms of preparedness, for example, or in terms of knowing when there is the danger of an epidemic coming. But I think more could have been learned in the sense that when you continue to travel through the West African region, the health infrastructures are still not up to the challenge, and so that's where the work needs to be emphasized. For example, primary care is something that must be enhanced, because if you take the rural areas, you don't want people to have to travel several kilometers to get to a hospital. And the tendency is to have these big hospitals in big cities and kind of neglect the rural areas, and it makes it hard if you can't access health facilities easily. So I think it's just, and also primary care is much more at a human level, and it goes faster and it further, and it's in terms of returns, it's much better and less anonymous as well, less frightening for people, because what we can observe is that modern medicine, or what you call conventional medicine, has in a way failed in Africa in general, and for sure in West Africa, because very often, like at the beginning of independence, the years following independence, we had these absolutely wonderful hospitals that were built at a very high cost, and with time, things started going wrong, and equipment did not function properly, and this and that, and in the end, hospitals became places where you were going to die if you had to go to a hospital, because first you had to pay for medicine, and medicine is expensive. And I think that we've got to look at a form of medicine that's much closer to what people need.
And thank you. And let's see, can you talk more about how women in their traditional role as caretaker were affected by Ebola in different ways, either directly or indirectly?
Well, women were strongly affected by the epidemic, because, of course, women tend to be the caregivers, as you just said. So they will tend to the young, they will tend to the old, and they're trying to keep the family together, and therefore they would go as far as possible in keeping the situation as normal, sometimes to their own risk. And they were at the forefront. So I think that that's one of the lessons of the Ebola epidemic, is that women needed to be trained and educated and informed about the disease, so that they could then care better for their family, for their families. And that's one big lesson, because they were known to have suffered a lot from the epidemic. Like, yes, because for very human reasons, a mother will not, even if the children fall sick, a mother will not abandon her children. So unfortunately, in a case of high contagion, this is an added risk. So it was necessary for women to learn for how to still care for their children, for example, or members of their families, but by learning to save them, what needed to be done to save them, which was not necessarily what would have happened normally in normal circumstances.
This is a question from Alta. As a multilingual writer, I wonder if you'd like to say a few words about your experience with translation. Has reaching readers of different languages and cultures affected the stories you choose to tell and how you tell them?
Well, when I write in French, I write in French. I am totally immersed in what I'm doing. I'm not thinking of translation. But it's interesting because when the moment of translation comes, and in English, I'm usually very involved in the translation. It's interesting because it's almost a rereading or a rewriting sometimes, or not a rewriting, but you look at the text informed by new circumstances, and it's very, very interesting. But what is important is that you lose certain aspects of the original text, but what you lose, I think you gain if it's a successful translation. But the translation will ease the passage to another culture, and that's, I think, very worth it. And it requires a lot of work, but I have done it from English into French, and it's always very rewarding, very, very rewarding.
Robert Frost said that poetry is what gets lost in translation. You're pointing out that things get gained in translation too.
No, for example, you take In the Company of Men, I think that the French version is more lyrical, let's say. It's more lyrical. But what the translation in English has gained, in my view, is the orality. I think that the text is like you're listening to the characters. They're almost talking to your ear. And I think that I'm happy with that. I'm happy that it has become even more oral, in my sense, even though we're talking about written
But in
piece
a
of
way,
work.
that's part of an answer to the first question, right? Which is that you, in working on your translation, you have the opportunity to do what the oral storyteller does, which is to, in some sense, retell a story you've already told.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. But you don't tell it in the same way, and that's the thing about storytelling. You never tell the same story. You have to adapt it to uh, your new listeners, the new audience.
So I'm just going to ask you one more question. This one is from Hannah. Besides your own work, what other Ivorian or West African writers can you recommend for us in the United States to read in order to get a better picture of what is happening in West Africa?
Ah, ah, ah. Well, it depends. If you want to go to the classics, you can start with Bernard Dadier, who is supposed to be the father of Ivorian literature. Then you can go to Amadou Ampateba, who was also extremely influential. And then, of course, you jump to Kuruma, who is really Amadou Kuruma, who is an extraordinary writer who has influenced a lot of Ivorian authors. And then you can come to somebody like Gauze, who is has written several very, very interesting novels. You have someone like Tanela Boni, who also has been a very influential writer. You have, and I hate doing this sort of thing because it's on the spot, and then I'm bound to forget someone. But it's in fact it's an exciting time because there's a lot of very good writing coming, and also there are more and more publishers, and the publishing scene is very interesting in Côte d'Ivoire. It's one of the most thriving in the I wouldn't say in the region, because we've got Nigeria, we've got Ghana, but it's doing very well in the Francophone world. And so you have also a lot of writers from the Francophone region who are coming to Côte d'Ivoire to get their books published. So I think it's, for the moment, it's a good scene, which has, of course, been affected by the pandemic, but in terms of the economic recession. But I have a strong belief that these difficulties will be overcome.
Espoir encore.
Espoir encore, because people do want to write, and there's a lot of very, very, very good poetry. We have someone like Noël Ebony, who wrote one collection, but such strength, and he really influenced a lot of poets. And somebody like Bernard Zadi was also very, very grounded in orality, and he came more from the west area of Côte d'Ivoire, and his poetry was very, very, very grounded in his cultural background.
Thank you both so much, Véronique and Kwame. It was an honor to host you. Is the book?
Buy the book.
Haven't bought it yet. There'll be a link in the chat for you to buy it. I hope to welcome you both back to the Center for Fiction in person someday.
Oh, with pleasure.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
You. Thank you very much, Kwame, and thank you, Melanie.
Good. It's lovely to talk to you. Thank you, Melanie, for bringing us together.